Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive. You know, William Faulkner once wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And that really hits home with what we're exploring today. We're peeling back a layer of history that's often, well, forgotten, but it has some pretty profound impacts. Our mission here, drawing from some fascinating material discussed by the BBC, is to look at this largely overlooked connection, the British Indian Empire's reach, its actual administrative reach, into the Arabian Peninsula. It's kind of startling, really. A big chunk of the Arabian Gulf, well, it was considered part of British India. And for those of you tracking current affairs, maybe our UPSC aspirants listening in for mains and prelims insights, this is pretty crucial stuff for understanding modern geopolitics. But honestly, it's just a fascinating story for anyone.
It really is remarkable. And it's not just, a few cultural overlaps or some diplomatic links. We're talking about a real foundational administrative connection, deeply embedded, but somehow it's been almost completely airbrushed out of the common story we tell ourselves.
Yeah, airbrushed is a good word for it.
It says so much about how empires work, the complexities, and, well, how easily history can be reshaped or forgotten based on later priorities.
Absolutely. So, okay, let's dive in. Where do we start this story? Maybe 1956, right? Picture this. 1956, a British journalist, David Holden, arrives in Bahrain. He's expecting, a standard assignment in Arabia. But what he finds instead are these incredible, almost ghostly echoes of colonial India everywhere. It's like stepping back in time. He actually attended a garden durbar, the formal Indian reception style.
Yes.
This one was held to honor Queen Victoria being named Empress of India. But here's the thing, it was nearly 80 years after it happened.
80 years, that's amazing.
Isn't it? And Holden wrote about seeing these traces all over the Gulf Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Oman. He called it the phantasmal sway of the Raj. Think about it. Servants called bearers, laundrymen, dobis, watchmen, chowkidars, all these Anglo-Indian terms still in common use. And he even mentioned this, ancient and agreeable Anglo-Indian ritual of a mountainous curry lunch on Sundays. It really paints a picture.
It absolutely does. And what's really key here is that these weren't just superficial things among, say, British expats. The Indian influence went deep, right into the administration, even affecting the local rulers.
How so?
Well, take the Sultan of Oman at the time. He'd actually been educated in Rajasthan.
Really? In India?
Yes. And apparently he was more fluent in Urdu than he was in Arabic.
Wow.
Or think about Kuwait, which is now eastern Yemen. Their soldiers were still wearing the old defunct uniforms of the Hyderabadi army.
That's incredible. It's like a time capsule.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Holden noticing this. The governor of Aden back then put it perfectly. He said something like, "One had an extraordinarily powerful impression that all the clocks here had stopped 70 years ago."
That the Raj was at its height, Victoria on the throne.
Yeah, I remember that quote. It's vivid.
Gilbert and Sullivan, a fresh and revolutionary phenomenon, and Kipling, a dangerous debunker. It really captures that feeling of suspended time, that strong link from Delhi through Hyderabad right to the South Arabian shore. So what allowed this? Why was this region seemingly frozen in that particular imperial moment?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It goes beyond just, cultural habits sticking around. It points to a very specific geopolitical setup and Britain's strategic goals there. And this is where it gets, as you said earlier, really interesting. Because it wasn't just cultural echoes, it was official. It was legal.
Official? How official?
In the early 20th century, nearly a third of the Arabian Peninsula was actually ruled as part of the British Indian Empire.
A third. Ruled from India.
Directly.
Yeah.
We're talking about a whole crescent of protectorates. Think Aden in today's Yemen, stretching all the way up the coast to Kuwait.
Okay.
These places were governed from Delhi. They were overseen by the Indian Political Service, that specialized group managing India's relations with princely states and foreign powers.
Read the IPS.
Policed by Indian troops. And ultimately, they answered to the Viceroy of India.
So this wasn't just informal influence, it was structured governance.
Absolutely structured. And it had a legal underpinning. There was this Interpretation Act of 1889. Under that act, these protectorates were legally defined as part of India.
Legally India. Wow.
Yeah. Lord Curzon, the viceroy, he even suggested Oman should be treated just like any other native state within the Indian Empire, like Lusbela or Kilat in Balochistan.
So places like Abu Dhabi were essentially listed alongside places like Jaipur.
Exactly. In the official list of India's semi-independent princely states, you'd find them right there, alphabetically. Abu Dhabi, Ajmer Merwara, Alwar.
That's a serious blurring of geographical lines. It makes you rethink the whole structure of the British Empire. India wasn't just the jewel, it was almost the administrative hub for a much wider region.
Precisely. It acted as the engine for imperial control far beyond its own borders.
But what did that mean long term? I mean, keeping this connection so, well, quiet, almost hidden. How did that affect how these Arabian states saw themselves, separate from India?
That's a really critical point. The secrecy definitely played a role in shaping identities later on. But first, just to grasp the scale of it day to day. Think about Aden again.
Okay, the westernmost port.
Right. It wasn't just influenced by India. It was administered as part of Bombay province, like actually part of it.
Part of Bombay.
Yeah. And get this, Indian passports were issued as far west as Aden.
Indian passports in Yemen.
That's how integrated it was. And this closeness even seeped into politics. When Mahatma Gandhi visited Aden in 1931,
He went to Aden.
he did. And he found many young Arabs there who actually identified as Indian nationalists. They shared that anti-colonial feeling.
Yeah.
It really shows you Aden's position as India's frontier.
That detail about the passports and Gandhi finding Indian nationalists there, that really brings it home. It wasn't just lines on some secret map, it was lived experience.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to the question, if it was so real, so extensive, why was it kept so quiet? Why didn't people in Britain or India, let alone the rest of the world, really know about this Arabian Raj?
Well, it was quite deliberate. You hit the nail on the head. It was kept quiet. Even at the time, public awareness was minimal. Those maps showing the full extent of the Indian Empire, including these territories, they were classified top secret.
Top secret maps.
And Arabian territories were often just left off public documents altogether.
Why the secrecy?
Geopolitics, mainly. They wanted to avoid provoking rival powers. First, the Ottoman Empire, which still had influence in the region. Later, the emerging power of Saudi Arabia. Neither would have been happy about seeing British India formally extending its control over so much of Arabia.
So it was basically a strategic silence, a hidden empire to avoid diplomatic trouble.
Precisely. There was that great quip by a Royal Asiatic Society lecturer. Something like, as a jealous sheik veils his favorite wife, so the British authorities shroud conditions in the Arab states in such thick mystery.
That ill-disposed propagandist might almost be excused for thinking that something dreadful is going on there.
Okay.
Yeah, that captures the deliberate obscurity.
It really does. It speaks volumes about the sensitive balancing act Britain was trying to perform, using secrecy as a tool of statecraft, essentially.
But was that sustainable? Hiding rule over a third of Arabia seems like it was bound to unravel.
Well, things did start to change. By the 1920s, the political winds were shifting, both in India and globally.
How so?
Within India, the nationalist movement was gaining strength, and nationalists were starting to imagine India differently, not just as this sprawling imperial territory, but as a distinct nation, a cultural entity with more defined borders.
Right, the idea of India itself was solidifying.
Exactly. And London saw this happening. They probably saw both an opportunity and maybe a necessity to start tidying up the imperial map, drawing clearer lines.
Which led to the first major separation.
Yes, Aden. On April 1st, 1937, Aden was formally separated from India.
April Fool's Day, ironically.
Huh? Yes. And it was a significant moment. King George VI sent a telegram that was read out. It said, Aden has been an integral part of British Indian administration for nearly 100 years. That political association with my Indian empire will now be broken.
And Aden will take its place in my colonial empire. A direct transfer from Indian administration to the colonial office in London.
A very clear, bureaucratic severing of that century-old tie. And it set a precedent.
A precedent for disentangling other territories.
Exactly. Although, interestingly, the Gulf protectorates, Bahrain, Kuwait, the trucial states like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, Oman, they actually remained under the government of India's control for another decade.
Really? Even after Aden was separated?
Yes. Right up until 1947. There were even some brief discussions around the time of Indian independence about whether the new India, or perhaps Pakistan, might inherit responsibility for the Persian Gulf.
Imagine that. India or Pakistan running the Gulf states.
It seems incredible now, doesn't it? But British officials in Delhi apparently decided pretty quickly that the Gulf was of little interest to the new Indian government.
Little interest. Wow. Talk about underestimating future importance.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And one British resident, William Hay, put it quite bluntly. He said something like, it would clearly have been inappropriate to hand over responsibility for dealing with the Gulf Arabs to Indians or Pakistanis.
You can read a lot into that phrasing.
Indeed. So the decision was made on April 1st, 1947, another April Fool's Day, just months before India and Pakistan gained independence and were partitioned. The Gulf states were formally separated from India's administration.
Another quiet bureaucratic decision with massive geopolitical consequences. It effectively redrew the map just before everything changed.
Absolutely. A pivotal moment.
But, as you said, the story doesn't quite end there. India becomes independent. Pakistan is created. But Britain stays in the Gulf.
For another 24 years, yes. It's quite remarkable. When Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who oversaw Indian independence, suggested pulling out of the Gulf territories at the same time, he was apparently shouted down.
Shouted down? By whom?
By others in his government, the Foreign Office, the military presumably, who saw the strategic value oil was becoming increasingly important, remember, and the perceived need to maintain influence there.
So they kept the structure, but changed who it reported to.
Exactly. Instead of answering to the viceroy in Delhi or Simla, the British officials running the Gulf now reported directly to Whitehall in London. It created this sort of Arabian Raj phase 2.
A direct London-run Raj.
Right. One scholar, Paul Rich, called it the Indian Empire's last redoubt, like a final outpost holding on after the main territory was gone.
And did the Indian influence disappear quickly then?
Not entirely. It lingered significantly. For years, the official currency in many Gulf states was still the Indian rupee, specifically the Gulf rupee.
The Gulf rupee. Didn't know about that.
Yes. And transport, shipping, it was often still dominated by the old British India line.
Mm-hmm.
And the administrators themselves, the British residents governing these 30 or so princely states, many were men who had built their entire careers in the Indian political service. Their mindset, their methods were still very much shaped by the Indian experience.
So the personnel and even the currency maintained that link for a while.
It really shows how important the Gulf was perceived to be by Britain strategically. Even after losing India, they held on to it tightly.
Until 1971.
Until 1971. That's when Britain finally withdrew as part of its larger decision to end its military and colonial commitments east of Suez.
And David Holden, the journalist we started with, he was there to see the end too, wasn't he?
He was. He wrote in July 1971 something like, "This final remnant of the British Raj has been for some years now an obvious, if in some ways charming, anachronism. But its day is over." A fitting bookend to his observations from 1956.
A charming anachronism whose day was over. But the history itself, the memory of it, seems to have faded even faster.
That's what's truly striking. How effectively this whole chapter, the administration from Delhi, the legal status as part of India, has been, well, erased from the popular national stories.
In the Gulf states themselves?
Yes. They certainly remember their relationship with Britain, the treaties, the British presence. But the governance from Delhi, that part is almost entirely absent from the official narrative.
Why do you think that is?
Well, for the monarchies there, the idea, the myth, perhaps, of an ancient, unbroken sovereignty is really important for legitimacy. A history of being administered as part of British India doesn't quite fit that picture.
So it's a kind of convenient forgetting, or maybe deliberate historical shaping.
You could certainly argue that it serves a purpose in constructing a particular national identity today.
But does anything remain, even private memories? You mentioned that scholar Paul Rich.
Yes, he did find echoes. He recorded an interview in 2009 with an elderly Qatari man. This man still vividly remembered getting beaten as a boy for stealing an orange from an Indian employee of the British agent. And the man said that back then, in his youth, the Indians were a privileged caste. He actually said it gave him immense pleasure that the tables had turned and that Indians now came to the Gulf as servants.
That's quite a charged memory, but it shows the imprint was real and complex.
Absolutely. It reveals those underlying social dynamics and power structures that existed because of this administrative link, even if the official history ignores it now.
And today, you look at Dubai. A glittering global hub. It's hard to imagine it as a minor outpost of the Indian Empire, somewhere listed alongside small princely states in India.
It's an incredible transformation.
And millions of Indians and Pakistanis live and work there now. Do you think many of them have any idea about this history? That there was a time when the Gulf might have become part of India or Pakistan, just like Hyderabad or Jaipur did?
I suspect very few are aware. It's just not part of the story that's told, either in South Asia or the Gulf.
It really underscores your point about that quiet bureaucratic decision in 1947.
Doesn't it? A decision made in the twilight of empire, severing a link that, had it remained, could have completely reshaped the modern map, the geopolitics, the economies, of both South Asia and the Middle East. It's a huge what if.
So we've taken quite the deep dive today into this forgotten Raj. We've uncovered a history that really does challenge how we usually think about the British Empire, about India, and about the Arabian Gulf.
It certainly complicates the neat narratives we often rely on.
And it makes you think, doesn't it, about the power of these seemingly small administrative choices, these quiet bureaucratic decisions, and how they ripple through history, shaping nations and identities. For our UPSC listeners, I hope this discussion has highlighted how these deeper, often hidden historical currents are still relevant. They subtly shape the current affairs landscape we study today, even if they're not always obvious. Understanding this nuance is, I think, really valuable.
Definitely. Context is everything.
And for everyone listening, here's something to chew on, a provocative thought. What if that decision in 1947 had gone the other way? Imagine if those oil-rich Gulf states, those protectorates, had been integrated into India or Pakistan like the other princely states were. How different would the world look today? The politics, the economics, the relationships between South Asia and the Gulf.
It's a mind-boggling alternative history to consider.
It really is. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe challenged some assumptions. If you found this conversation insightful, please do give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and maybe leave a comment below. Any questions, thoughts, further queries, we'd love to hear them. Your engagement really helps us continue bringing these kinds of forgotten but important stories to light. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.